this is a bit of a bizarre question, but it had me thinking as you were speaking about mortality as it relates to money, because one of the perspectives on money is YOLO.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? I'm only going to live once,
Yeah.
so I might as well have a good time. I think I definitely have more of a bias in that direction, although I'm not fully in that direction. And my brother, who's a year older than me, is one that gave me your book and has worked as a stockbroker and actuarial scientist. At 12 years old, he was budgeting his pocket money on an Excel document, whereas I was just spending, spending, spending. And he thinks much more long term. He's like investing in his pension at 21,
Yeah.
whereas I was like at the casino, not the literal casino, a figurative casino. I
Yeah.
was taking bigger risks and just rolling the dice. And my somewhat illogical way of rationalizing my behavior and not investing as much in my pension was, I'm only going to live once anyway. So I might as well just enjoy my life.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the coffees and saving and all this stuff, a lot of people will be thinking, yes, but compounding's fine, but I want to
Enjoy life.
enjoy life.
I think about a thing when I was in my early 20s at this point, and there was a coworker of mine, and he was I don't know 10 years older than me, and he had $25,000 of credit card debt, which I could not fathom at the time. That was such an incomprehensible amount of credit card debt that he was paying 17% interest on. And at the time, I just thought, and all the debt came from trips that he had taken. He traveled Europe and traveled through Asia and had a great time doing it, but he put it all on his credit card. At the time, I remember thinking, "You idiot! Do you understand what this is going to do to your future?" And then he died when he was about 32.
Wow.
And now,
My
and
age.
then I remember thinking, like, I'm so glad you took those trips. I'm so glad you went into that credit card debt, because the truth was that at age 32, he had seen more and done more than most people would at age 62. And so I think about that a lot of like, it's always a balance. And the truth is that you and I don't know, are we going to live until we're 110 or die tomorrow? Nobody knows, of course. One thing I think a lot about as a parent is that I've been a big saver my entire life. Since I got my first job at age 16, I've saved the majority of what I've made in every job that I've ever been in. And it would be easy to look at someone like me and say, Morgan, if you were on your deathbed tomorrow, you'd probably regret the vacations you didn't take and the dinners you didn't have, right? You'd regret that. My answer is absolutely not, because if I was on my deathbed tonight, I would take so much joy knowing that my wife and kids are going to be okay because of what I saved. That would
Mm.
be the worst situation I would be in, is on my deathbed and looking at my wife and kids and knowing you guys are screwed. I'm leaving you debt, you know? And so, but that might change as I get older. And so when my kids are hopefully financially self-sufficient, will I still think that? Will I still have that need to be like, I need to work and save to provide for my young kids? That's not going to last forever. So it'll change throughout your life.
That is literally the worst thought in the world, isn't it? To think that you could be on your deathbed and look over at your family and know that they're about to struggle with bills and
Yeah.
with food, and they're probably going to have to sell the house, and their lifestyle's completely going to change when you go. I don't even have kids yet, but I was just thinking about my partner being stood
There's
there
no,
outside.
there's no worse nightmare than that. I think there's an opposite of that, which is in several of the books and studies that have been done on dying. There are quite a few people who have very peaceful deaths, people who know they're going to die of terminal illness, and they're pretty much at ease with it. And when you dig into like, what is those people's psychology? How do you know you're going to die in 6 months and you're kind of at ease with it? One of the big factors is knowing that your family is going to be okay without you,
Mm.
because they are sufficient and they don't rely on you for wisdom and advice as much as they can take care of themselves. But the opposite, if you're on your deathbed and you're like, my children, my spouse is going to have a real hard time without me, that's the most painful thing you can imagine.
I could also imagine that one of the great regrets one might have on their deathbed is just not having lived. Because I was
Yeah.
thinking about, I sometimes ponder, if I die now, how would I feel? Like if I was given a diagnosis, God forbid, how would I feel? And I feel like I've really gone for it with my life.
Yeah.
I feel
Yeah.
like I've traveled, I've seen things, I've done things, I've met people, I've lived. So there's a certain smile on my face or gratitude when I think about this being the end.
Yeah.
So it's a balancing act, isn't it? Between like, I guess you can do both.
Between the two, between my
Yeah.
friend who buried himself in credit card debt, even though I'm glad, like I'm glad he did it given his short life, versus the people who save everything for the end. David Cassidy, who's a very famous childhood actor and had an incredible acting career. He died, I don't know when he died, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever it was. His last words were so much wasted time. Those are his last words. And like you think about, and this is someone who was like very rich and famous, had like a very enviable life. And you can't think of sadder last words than so much wasted time. And I think like no matter, this is like the Jeff Bezos philosophy on business was he started Amazon because he was trying to imagine himself at age 90, looking back and having the fewest regrets. He was like, that should be your framework for life, is that when you're on your deathbed, you have the fewest regrets possible. And he did it because he was like, if I don't start Amazon, I'm going to regret it. But if I do start Amazon and it fails, I won't regret that. So just understanding, like, I think that's a good philosophy. That's probably the broadest definition of risk, is understanding what you're likely to regret in the future. And I don't think anyone has a perfect calibration on that. Like there's a good chance that, heaven forbid, if you did get a diagnosis tomorrow, as you just said, that yes, you would look back and say, man, I really went for it. But you also might look back and be like, man, and not you individually, but any of us would look back and say like, man, I wish I had done this different. I wish I was nicer to that person. I wish I had called this person more,
Worked less.
Right.
That's a
Maybe.
big one.
Yeah.
I think Bronnie Ware found that palliative nurse in Australia, when she interviewed people in their deathbeds, that like, I wish I'd worked less, was super high.
And not a single of those people looking back in those situations on their deathbed when they're 90 years old will look back and say, I wish I worked harder.
Yeah.
But virtually every one of them will say, I wish I spent more time with my kids. I wish I spent more time with my family. I wish I was nicer to myself. I wish I'd let myself be who I actually was.
I think the top regret of the dying from her work was that I wish I'd lived a life more true to myself, which I
Yes.
kind of interpret as like, I wish I'd done something else.
And this gets back to the Chuck Feeney idea of the billionaire who said, I don't want to, I want to live my way. Like being independent is so core to people's happiness. And as I said earlier, like we come from different backgrounds, we have different aspirations, but independence is a very human, natural, universal aspiration to be able to live life in your own way.
I'm not sure if we talk about this much, but for that person who doesn't have financial independence because they're entrenched with debts and bills and all these kinds of things, how does one get out of that situation? Because we can't necessarily just save our way out of that situation, can we?
People do. It's
Yeah.
difficult because it's likely that the mindset and psychology that got you there is going to be very difficult to break, extremely difficult to break. I heard this statistic one time. This is a completely different topic, but I think this applies to a lot of things. That the statistic that is most predictive on whether you will cheat on your spouse is how many people you slept with before you got married. The implication being it's very difficult to just flip a switch and say, I'm a different person now. And I think that that idea can apply to a lot of different things in life. And the psychology of I spend way more than I make and I don't care about money and debt, debt, debt. Some people can wake up one day and say, no more of that. I'm going to run in the other way. A lot of people find it very difficult to do. I think one of the hard things about money that's hard to admit for a lot of people, but there's truth to it, is that on the nature nurture spectrum, a lot of it does lean towards nature, that some people are just wired. Your brother was wired to plan and save, and you were wired to take entrepreneurial risks in maybe a way that he wasn't. And so a lot of it is, yes, you can learn. Yes, you can learn from others and learn new ideas to think about, but we shouldn't pretend that we can fundamentally rewire who we are.
The hardest conversations are often the ones we avoid. But what if you had the right question to start them with? Every single guest on the Diary of a CEO has left behind a question in this diary. And it's a question designed to challenge, to connect, and to go deeper with the next guest. And these are all the questions that I have here in my hand. On one side, you've got the question that was asked, the name of the person who wrote it. And on the other side, if you scan that, you can watch the person who came after who answered it. 51 questions split across 3 different levels: the warm-up level, the open-up level, and the deep level. So you decide how deep the conversation goes. And people play these conversation cards in boardrooms at work, in bedrooms, alone at night, and on first dates, and everywhere in between. I'll put a link to the conversation cards in the description below, and you can get yours at thediary.com. Just to close off on this point of saving money, are there any tactics or tricks or ways to think about how to save for those people that might be working in a factory and that don't have a ton of excess income every month?
I think if you view savings as I need to save for something in the future, that's hard for people to do. If you have a little bit of a mindset shift and say, I'm going to save so I can become more independent, so that if I lose my job, I don't have to panic and go find the first one that's available. I can take my time and find another one. That's independence. If you have a medical emergency, you're going to have some options on how to treat it and where to go. That's independence. Viewing every dollar that you save as a token of independence, I think, is a mindset shift that makes it a lot easier for people to do versus if they're just saying, I need to save to buy a new car.
I asked this because earlier on I looked at the most Googled questions around saving, and the most popular question is how to save money.
Yeah.
How to save money.
Now, they might be asking, like, what to do with my savings. Do I put it in a checking account? Do I put it in a savings account? Do I invest it? That might be part of it.
Oh,
Or it might be as similar as you're saying with tariffs. People genuinely don't know what it means.
the second most Googled is what is a high yield savings account?
Yeah. And I think that those questions, they're not bad questions. There's no bad questions. I was asking those questions at one point in my life too. But it gets to the point of, like, you have an obligation to understand how money works and what it's going to do to you and how to manage it. It's not a nice to have. Everyone's going to have to deal with these topics, whether they like it or not.
I love this quote from your book where you say one of the most powerful ways to increase your savings isn't to raise your income, it's to raise your humility.
Yeah. I think you get there when you realize, like, nobody's looking at you as much as you are. And nobody cares about your Range Rover and your Rolex as much as you did. They may have meant a lot to you, but no one else was thinking about them that much because they were busy thinking about themselves. They were busy thinking about their own car. And you realize how much modern spending, and this has increased in the social media age the last 10 or 15 years, is trying to get strangers' attention. It's trying to put on a show, put on a performance for people that you think are paying attention to you, but they're absolutely not. They're not paying any attention to you whatsoever. And so, like, lowering your or like raising your humility is one way to think about it. But it's also just realizing, like, who do you want attention from? It's different for everybody. For me, I want my wife, my kids, my parents, and like 3 friends to love me. And I desperately care about their attention. I desperately care what my kids and my wife and my parents think of me. And it's fundamental to my happiness. And from there, it declines real quick. There's a couple of really close friends who are in there, and then there's some, like, colleagues and whatnot, and it declines very quickly from there. And strangers, the person driving on the street, could not care in the slightest. And maybe that sounds obvious, but so much of what we do with money is a performance to impress that guy who's not paying any attention to you whatsoever. And so I want to put a lot of effort into fostering the relationships with those 6 or 7 people. I want to put tremendous effort into that and very little from there. And here's the thing. If I got a Ferrari, would my wife love me more? Like, no. Would my kids admire me more? No. And so the people who I want to love me are not impacted by the fancy things that I would buy.
So what do you spend your money on?
We live a pretty decent material life, but I also spend a lot of money. So the biggest expense that I have, what I spend money on, is independence. And I view that as a thing I'm spending money on. I spend money on controlling my calendar. I spend money on the ability to say no to work that I don't want to do. I view it as I'm financially independent, and so I can do the work that I want to do. And I've been working on that for 25 years. What else do I spend money on? Here's what's interesting. My son, back in the green room, you asked about him. There's a thing I was thinking about just a couple weeks ago. I grew up as a skier. I was a ski racer in Lake Tahoe. And always, particularly when I was younger, there were always people on my ski team who had better gear than me. They had the newer skis and newer boots and cooler gear and whatnot. And I hated it. It made me so insecure. I hated it. And one of the things that I did was, when my son started skiing a couple years ago, I was like, I'm going to buy you the best stuff, because I was insecure, and I'm gonna make up for that little chip on my shoulder. I'm gonna buy you the best gear. And here's the thing: he couldn't care less about it. He could not care less about the fancy stuff that he has. Couldn't care less about it. So everyone's different in that, and it also gets back to, like, a lot of spending is based off of a story or a scar that you had from earlier in your childhood.
And where is your capital allocation today? We spoke about this a little bit last time, but in terms of percentages.
Yeah.
You have a ton of cash. You said roughly what percentage of your net worth?
20, 25% maybe. We own a house outright, and then the rest in stocks. It's a very simple. Our entire net worth is a house, cash, Vanguard index funds, and shares of Markel, where I'm on the board of directors. That's it. That's my entire net worth. It's as simple and boring and bland as you could possibly get. And what I want to do with that, the reason I keep it so boring, is the variable that I want to maximize for is endurance, as we spoke about earlier. So if my finances are so simple, then I can spend all of my like mental energy. All of the strategy is how can I make sure that I can just keep this going for as long as I possibly can?
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.